This lesson is section 1.5, Angle Relationships. The objective will be to identify and use special pairs of angles. So first let's talk about the special angle pairs that we are going to not only use for this lesson, but you will use these angle pairs for the rest of the time that you are in geometry. The first one is vertical angles. These are opposite angles formed by two intersecting lines. So the angles are kind of going to make an X. Here's an example of what it looks like. So here we have two different lines forming an X, which gives us four different angles. Let's point out angles 1 and 2. Since these are opposite angles that are formed by the X, these are vertical angles. Another pair of vertical angles that we have are angles 3 and 4. Next we have adjacent angles. These are coplanar angles with a common side and a common vertex. So basically, these are just angles that are next to each other. The word adjacent means next to. So here we have two angles that are next to each other. Notice that they have a common side and they have a common vertex. So angles 1 and 2 are adjacent angles. Next we have complementary angles. These are going to be two angles whose measures add up to 90 degrees. Here we have one angle that adds up to 90 degrees. Notice that I added in the square in the corner of the 90 degree angle. This is the notation that you will always use to show that an angle is 90 degrees. Now I made this really big and dramatic to point it out, but normally it'll just be a small square in the corner. You can never assume that an angle is 90 degrees. The problem either has to tell you that it's 90 degrees, or you will see this notation marking that it's 90 degrees. So, if I was to draw in another ray, I have formed two angles that add up to 90 degrees. Angle 1 and angle 2. Supplementary angles. These are going to be two angles whose measures add up to 180 degrees. If you remember from the last lesson, a straight line is going to form 180 degrees. So say that I threw in another ray, that would make two angles that add up to 180 degrees. So angles 1 and angle 2 are supplementary. The way that you can remember the difference between complementary and supplementary angles is that the supplementary angles, you could easily make the S into an 8. So that's how that I remember it. Now let's start learning about special characteristics of our angle pairs. Vertical angles are always going to be congruent. So this right here is just a shorthand. Vertical angles are congruent. Remember, this is the congruent symbol. Our first example, find the value of x. Well, here we are given two vertical angles. We know that vertical angles are congruent, so that's going to make their measures equal. So we set up the equation 3x plus 35 is equal to 4x. Now we just need to solve this algebraically. We get all of our variables onto one side and get that x is equal to 35. Next, supplementary angles. If two angles are supplements of the same angle or congruent angles, then the two angles are congruent. So that's a mouthful and maybe hard to understand, so let's look at a visual example. Angles 1 and 2 are supplementary. I know that they are supplementary because if I was to add them together, they form a line. Angles 2 and 3 are also supplementary because they also form a line. So let's say that I made angle 1 30 degrees. that would make angle 2 150 degrees because they have to add up to 180. If angle 2 is 150 degrees, that would make angle 3 30 degrees because since they are supplementary angles, they have to add up to 180. Notice that angle 1 and angle 3 are now equal. The reason is because they are both supplements to the same angle, angle 2. So angles 1 and 3 are both supplementary to the same angle, which makes them congruent. Complementary angles. If two angles are complements of the same angle, then the two angles are congruent. So here let's draw another example. Remember, complementary means that they add up to 90 degrees. So here we have a 90-degree angle, and now I have two angles adding up to that 90-degree angle. Let's say the first angle is 30 degrees. That means that the other angle has to be 60 degrees in order for them to be complementary. Now let's throw in another angle, and let's show that this angle is also forming a 90-degree angle with a 30 degrees. So that means that these two angles are going to be complementary. Well, if they're complementary, that means this new angle has to equal 60 degrees as well. So notice that this angle and this angle are both complementary to the 30-degree angle. Since they are both complementary to the same angle, that makes them congruent. Let's try another example. Identify a pair of each of the important angle pairs from this picture. So here are the four different angle pairs that we need to identify in the picture. Remember, you only need to find one pair. I'm going to list all the possible pairs that are out there. So, vertical angles. The two vertical angles shown in the picture are angles ASB and angle DSC. Remember that you need to name an angle either by the number that's given, which none of these have a number given, by the vertex. We could not just call these angle S and angle S because you wouldn't know which angle I was talking about. So we have to name the angles by the three letters: a side, a vertex, and another side. Next we have adjacent angles. There are a lot of adjacent angles. So look to see if your answer falls in any of these pairs. Angle ESA, angle ASB, and so on. There are 5 different possibilities that you could have picked. Remember, it's okay for the E and the A to be switched. The S just needs to be in the middle. So you may have a different answer than this if you just switch the first and the last letters. Complementary angles. This one may be a little bit more tough to see. The only pair of complementary angles in this picture is angles ESD and angle CSD. Now you may be thinking, Miss Caden, how do you know that angle ESD and angle CSD add up to 90? Well, there's a couple ways that you could figure this out. First of all, this is a straight line. That means that it equals 180 degrees. If you subtract 90 and 45 from 180, you're going to get 45 left over here. 45 plus 45 equals 90, which means that these two are complementary. Another way you could have figured this out is if this angle up here is 90 degrees, then this ESC has to be 90 degrees. If that's 90 degrees, then they're going to be complementary. Now for supplementary angles, you could have picked angle BSC and angle CSD, or you could have picked angle ASB and angles BSC. Next example, you need to pick out what is wrong with this picture. Well, there are two things wrong with this picture. First of all, the vertical angles are not congruent. Anytime you have vertical angles, they have to be congruent. Next, not all the angles that are supposed to be supplementary are supplementary. Right here, the 60 and the 130 do not add up to 180, and the 120 and the 50 do not add up to 180, and those are both supposed to be supplementary angles. So now we're going to try a couple examples using all the different things that we've learned today. This says find the value of each variable. Anytime you are given a diagram, you first need to look for the different special angle pairs that you can find. The first one that I notice is these two angles, which are going to be congruent because they're vertical angles. So immediately I can write an equation because I know if two things are congruent, they are equal. So I have 7x plus 2 is equal to 65. 7x is equal to 63, which means x is equal to 9. Now the other special angle pair that I have up here are these two angles, which are supplementary. Angles that are supplementary add up to 180 degrees. So now that I have my equation, I'm combining like terms, subtracting over the 66, and finally dividing by 4 to get my answer that y is equal to 28.5. It is perfectly okay to get a decimal. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Why don't you try this one on your own? The measures of two complementary angles are 7x plus 17 and 3x minus 20. Find the measures of the angles. One of the things that I have said in a previous video is if you are not given a picture, you have to draw a picture. It's going to always help you. So what I'm going to do is draw two complementary angles. I'm going to label one of them 7x plus 17 and the other one 3x minus 20. Now I can start writing an equation. I know that these two angles are going to add up to 90, so I'm going to write an equation saying 7x plus 17 plus 3x minus 20 is equal to 90. Now that I have an equation with one variable, I can go ahead and solve for x. I combine like terms on the left-hand side, add over the 3, and finally divide by 10 to get that x is equal to 9.3. Last example, make sure you pause the video and try this one on your own. The first special angle pair that I notice are the vertical angles. I know vertical angles are congruent, so I'm going to set these two measures equal. Now I just need to subtract 1 and divide by 4 to get that x is equal to 13. The next angle pair that I see are the supplementary angles that fall along the line. I know supplementary angles add up to 180, so I'm going to do 7y minus 48 plus 50. I'm sorry, I circled the wrong one. I meant to do these two were supplementary. See, even teachers make mistakes. Anyways, these two are supplementary and these two are supplementary. Technically, this one equals 53 as well because these are vertical angles and we just found that this was 13. So it's okay that we have these two circled. They are supplementary, but I meant to circle these two. So anyways, we're going to combine our like terms, subtract over the 5, and finally divide by 7. So y is going to be equal to 25.